Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
Because I now am a widow, and that means I'm a widow now 3 years, and I'm starting to date. You don't know what it's like, especially men, because it's a man's world. Every man, let me tell you, in this room, I don't care how old you are, as long as you live, you're a catch. Do you understand how lucky you are? We have an extra man. Bring him along. He's 98. Bring him. He's dead. Bring him. We'll prop him. A woman, and now I go to singles bars. Are you married? Do you know you like young guys? I do not. I just like a guy that breathes. I had a guy that was so old he picked me up in a hearse. I mean, it's like, we went to dinner. I made him pay in advance. I got nervous. Do you know? I mean, and to have to meet men. I went into a bar to do a guy lonesome. He said, "Not that lonesome."
Good morning. It's Wednesday, Apollo Wednesday, September the 10th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Varney and Company, motivation, meditation, and Apollo. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you, Maria Bartiromo, then Stu.
Fist bumps. Wonderful news on inflation. Producer prices rose much less than we thought. 2.6%. The expectation was 3.3. Great news for stocks. It also suggests we're going to get a rate cut next week.
There you go. Ashley.
I'm watching what's happening in the Senate. President Trump's going to get 48 of his nominees confirmed probably by the beginning of next week. So, Leader Thune moved the nuclear option so we can actually get people confirmed.
That is going to be good news for President Trump, who's been so frustrated by the slow roll.
And some of these ambassadors, assistant secretaries that will actually be in the office.
There you go. Adam Johnson, Ashley Davis, thank you. My time is up. I'll see you tomorrow, but Stuart Varney takes over. Good morning.
I'll take it. Good morning, Cheryl. Good morning, everyone. Today's inflation report is important for investors. The Fed looks at it. Wall Street looks at it. All right, here it is. In August, prices at the producer level, that is prices paid by businesses, went down 0.1%. The previous month, it had spiked upward. Over the last year, the index went up just 2.63%. All right, here's what the analysts say. They say inflation is moderating. And here's how the market's reacting to it. Investors like it. The Dow unchanged to a fraction higher. The S&P is up 33, but the NASDAQ, that index is up 128 points. The 10-year yield down a fraction, just 407, not down that much. The 2-year Treasury yields just above 3.5%. The Bitcoin, the last we quoted it was 112, now it's 113.4, going up. Oil inching higher following the Israeli attack on Hamas leadership in Qatar. It's at $63 a barrel. Okay, one more financial story. Oracle stock, it is soaring, and so is founder Larry Ellison's net worth. Overnight, Ellison's wealth went up around $70 billion. He's now the number 2 ranked billionaire at $350 billion. He's just behind Elon Musk. The left will feast on this. $70 billion in one day. On the show today, Poland shoots down Russian drones deep inside Poland. Was that a deliberate incursion or a mistake? Not clear, but it is military action inside a NATO country. President Trump not happy. He's suggesting the Europeans impose 100% tariffs on China and India because they buy Russian oil. More repercussions from the North Carolina train stabbing. The suspect may face federal charges, which means he could face the death penalty. North Carolina Republicans hold a news conference today to, quote, bring to light the failure of Charlotte's Democrat leadership, end quote. Kamala Harris says Biden's decision to run for re-election amounted to recklessness. Some excerpts from her book have been published. They bring fascinating reading, and we will bring it to you. Wednesday, September the 10th, 2025.
And that was Maria and Stu. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of Jerry Wayne.
It come folded once like a sermon note passed in church, smelling of printer ink and quiet judgment. Notice of non-compliance, it thundered as if Gabriel himself had blown a trumpet over 2 inches of grass that leaned heavenward in its own rebellion. They say my trash can lingers too long at the curb, loitering like a broke cousin who don't know when to go home. They call it unsightly, but I reckon a plastic bin scarred by sun and wind is no uglier than the souls who wrote this letter with clipboards for hearts. They say my shutters are the wrong color, turquoise. Though to me they are a hymn to the Gulf where the water once baptized my boyhood. They demand beige, the color of cowardice, conformity baked into latex paint. Harmony, they call it. Harmony don't come from sameness. It comes from voices raised in discord that somehow make a song. And I reckon I'll cut the grass. I'll drag the can. I will bow before this faceless council. But fines be damned. The turquoise stays.
And that was Jerry Wayne. Back in a minute. Thank you. So as far as I just found out about it and listening on the radio about the shooting of Charlie Kirk, co-founder of Turning Point USA. So the only thing, I want to wait a few days about him and about the young lady that was murdered because I just don't want to, I just out of respect for these victims. And but I did want to say something about Charlie Kirk in that all the things I'm seeing on social media, all the lefties are predictable. They're doing their predictable thing. They're trying to suggest that somehow Charlie Kirk deserved it. There's one person on the left that has surprised me, and that was Pete Buttigieg, who used to be the transportation secretary under the Biden administration. And he wrote, quote, "Horrific to hear that Charlie Kirk was shot today in Utah. Political violence must be always and totally rejected. Praying for him and all who may have been injured or impacted." So again, that was Pete Buttigieg on the shooting of Charlie Kirk. Back in a minute. And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of meditation.
Welcome to Moniculi Wellness and Healing. Hi, I'm Monica McCarthy, here to help you create balance, harmony, and peace in your life. In today's video, we're diving into a 3-minute mindfulness meditation designed to bring you into the present moment and cultivate a sense of peace. Find a comfortable position, either sitting or lying down. Close your eyes and take a deep breath in. And slowly exhale. Let's begin. Take a slow, deep inhale through your nose. Feel your belly expand. Hold for a moment. And now exhale through your mouth, letting go of any tension. Breathe in calm. Breathe out stress. With each breath, allow yourself to settle into this moment. Nothing to do, nowhere to be. Just here and now. Now bring awareness to your body. Notice the gentle rise and fall of your breath. The feeling of the air on your skin. The subtle sounds around you. Simply observe without judgment. If thoughts arise, acknowledge them and let them float by like clouds in the sky. Always returning to your breath in this moment. Now silently repeat to yourself. I am present. I am calm. I am at peace. Take one last deep inhale and a slow, gentle exhale. When you're ready, open your eyes, bringing this mindfulness into your day. Thank you for sharing this moment of presence with me.
And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Apollo.
2. It was impossible that anyone should sit down, absorb this Torah of flight control, then go out and be a controller on a mission. Nor could anyone expect to learn it all through actual mission experience. As Apollo was gearing up for its first flight in 1968, there had been no manned flights since November 1966. What the flight control team needed above all else was practice, and it was to this end that the simulation people plied their trade. The Simulation Control Area, SCA, was a room to the right of the Mokur proper, down on ground level with the trench. A long picture window opened onto the Mokur to let the simulation controllers in the SCA watch what was happening to their victims. Inside the room were 2 U-shaped work areas of consoles that looked just like those in the control room. This was where the simulations, sims, were played out, making the mission rules and the mission techniques come to life. The simulation supervisor, called Sim Soup, was for the controllers what the flight instructor is for the novice pilot. The simulations had 4 distinct functions. First, they were a way of keeping in shape, the equivalent of 5-finger exercises for a pianist. Second, they gave everyone a chance to see whether the mission rules and techniques that worked on paper also worked when put to a test. Third, they gave the controllers experience in how to deal with the particular set of emergencies portrayed in a particular sim. And fourth, they made the controllers familiar with fear, putting them through such hair-raising, gut-wrenching adventures that nothing they encountered in an actual flight could seem more terrifying or hopeless. The one point emphasized by everyone who was in the Apollo Mocher is that simulations never felt like games or even practice runs. Their verisimilitude and the seriousness with which they were taken reproduced even the emotions of the real thing. Controllers swore that, with momentary exceptions, they felt no more anxiety during missions than they had during the sims. To Gene Kranz, the sims were the reason the missions succeeded. I could say it's hard work, perseverance, all of those things, but it was the training process that did several things to you. First of all, it humbled you, and you'd have your successes too, and you felt good about them. You learned to pay exquisite attention to detail. You learn the nuances of the voices that are talking to you on these loops. By the time you're finished, they have worked you over so much and so well and so thoroughly that you never considered failure. In Mercury days, the sims had been primitive. Harold Miller, a young Langley engineer from Tennessee, had been put in charge of developing Project Mercury's simulation capability. He didn't know anything about simulations, nobody did, but somebody had to do it. And, as he later recalled, he didn't know enough to say no. He began to put together a team. Dick Coos was one of his early additions, and they tentatively began to build digital tapes that would, for example, simulate a trajectory that was not quite up to orbit. Then they would see if the tape produced realistic effects on the flight controller's meters. In those days, everything was on meters instead of CRTs, which were not yet available. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. Lightning from the afternoon thundershowers at the Cape, attracted by all the antennae on the roof of the Mercury Control Center, would produce power surges that set the meters back to their zero state. The computers broke down, and sometimes the men in the sim room broke down. Because they didn't yet have programs that could automatically adjust the scenario to respond to the actions of the flight control team, the simulation controllers had to do it by hand, frantically turning knobs on a panel, trying to calibrate their responses so that the telemetry streams looked reasonably plausible to the people in the control room. They got more adroit as time went on, but it remained pretty rough. The remote sites gave the Mercury and Gemini sims a special flavor as well. Though Mercury Control at the Cape had voice links with the remote sites, they couldn't transfer flight data back and forth in real time. Each remote site, therefore, had to be a miniature Mercury Control with its local director and FIDO and Capcom, passing on instructions from the Cape, but also prepared in an emergency to take action on its own. For the sim guys, the absence of a data link meant that they had to prepare separate data tapes for each of the remote sites. They would have a worldwide countdown so that the tapes would all begin at the same moment, and everyone around the world would have a view of the same problem at the same time. But this also put a considerable burden on the sim soup to anticipate events during the course of the sim. The sim soup had to guess what you were going to do and when you would do it, one of the controllers recalled, which was the tough thing to do. You'd make a decision to abort now, but the tape didn't say abort now, so the damn thing would keep flying. In those days, simulations also provided a prime opportunity for practical jokes. As the space program grew, the jokes tapered off, but in the early years, nobody was sacrosanct, not even Chris Kraft. Things happened in the Mercury and Gemini sims that would have been unthinkable 5 years later. For example, Chris Kraft's console in the Mercury Control Center included a screen that showed a live television shot of the launch pad. During simulations, the Redstone or Atlas, of course, just sat there, but the camera was nonetheless always turned on. One day, a controller named John Hatcher substituted a tape of a launch for the live picture. Hatcher synchronized the tape with the simulated countdown and waited for the moment of launch. As always during Mercury, Chris Kraft was the flight director. At T-0, as Kraft pushed the little gear lever that started the clocks, the redstone on the television screen belched smoke and fire and lifted off the pad. The gear lever wasn't hooked up to anything that could conceivably have launched a rocket, but the sight was too compellingly realistic to be discounted. "Look at that," Kraft yelled in dismay to Krantz, who was sitting beside him at the assistant flight director's console. Krantz, in on the joke, sat expressionless. "Did you see that?" Kraft cried out again, pointing insistently at the screen, and a story was born that would be told and embroidered upon for years to come. The sobering presence of Chris Kraft normally kept such behavior within bounds. Out at the remote sites, life was more unbuttoned. Ed Fendel was one of the many free spirits sent out to run a remote site. As local director at the Hawaii site during Sims for Gemini 7, he was dissatisfied with his Capcom, an Air Force officer in training for what was expected to be the manned orbiting laboratory, later canceled. The guy thought that all he had to do was to pass on what Fendel told him. He couldn't understand that he had to dig in and learn for himself how the systems worked. So Fendel took it into his head to show the Air Force Capcom that he had to learn how to take charge. Fendel got on the phone with Carl Shelley, a sim soup back in Houston, where the control center had moved after Gemini 3, and arranged that during the next sim, Fendel would fake a heart attack. Shelley gave his approval. Fendel told his surgeon what he was up to. At the appropriate point during the simulation, Fendel clutched his chest, groaned loudly, and toppled out of his chair. The surgeon rushed over, announced that Fendel was hors de combat, and motioned for Capcom to take over. The indolent Capcom was shaken. "Honolulu, this is Gemini 7. Honolulu, this is Gemini 7, he called in confusion, and began to find out why he was supposed to be on top of things. Fendel was pleased. In fact, he was loving it, until a second physician waiting to come on shift, an elderly Navy doctor whose presence Fendel had not anticipated, rushed over to examine him. Fendel held his breath. "I think he's dead," the old gentleman announced, and began to administer cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It still would have been okay, except that back in Houston, Shelley had forgotten to tell Chris Kraft that it was all a charade. For the next few hours, there were messages coming in from Houston inquiring solicitously about the status of Fendel. Later on, of course, it came out that it was all part of the sim, Fendel said, and Kraft just went berserk. He liked to kill Shelley. But it worked, Fendel added. The Capcom took over, ran a series of passes, and we had a good time. The jokes notwithstanding, the Sims were deadly serious business, no more so than in the elemental life-and-death decision named abort. An abort during Mercury and Gemini usually meant deorbiting and coming home early. An abort during Apollo could mean coming home early, or it could refer to halting an attempt to land on the moon and returning the LEM to the command module in lunar orbit. The worst abort situation would be during powered flight with the astronauts strapped to a Saturn rocket that could kill them within seconds. I approached each launch and rode through each 5 minutes of powered flight in a state of petrified terror, recalled tough old Walt Williams of the Mercury launches, and it didn't get any easier for the people who controlled the Gemini and Apollo flights. Of all the possibilities of catastrophe during powered flight, the worst was what the simulation people called the pad fallback case, in which the booster lost power within seconds after liftoff. The astronauts could have survived such an event, at least theoretically. The escape tower on the Apollo spacecraft generated 134,000 pounds of thrust on an 11,000-pound spacecraft for 3 seconds. An experience that would have left the astronauts battered by the G-forces, but would have gotten the spacecraft away from the Saturn before the fireball engulfed it. But the abort decision in such a case would have to be made instantly by sensors within the booster that were supposed to detect the incipient catastrophic failure before the control center or the astronauts would have time to react. If the launch vehicle had risen a few hundred feet above the pad, then booster had about 4 seconds to look at his data, decide something was wrong, and call an abort. Booster therefore had an independent abort capability on his console, consisting of a toggle switch with a red cover to light the onboard abort light and a voice link with the spacecraft. All aborts required both cues. To Krantz, that was the worst case, and the Sims included one every so often to keep Booster mentally prepared to give up so abruptly on the mission. After the vehicle had gained some altitude, the abort decision became more leisurely. 2 people, in addition to Booster, had abort switches, and now they played decisive roles. One was, of course, Flight himself. The other was Fido. Neither one of them actually caused an abort to happen by flipping his switch. Instead, they lit an alarm light informing the crew that an abort situation had arisen, leaving it to the crew to take the action to initiate the abort. The abort itself could take one of 2 forms, depending on the situation: separating the spacecraft from the rest of the stack and firing the escape rocket, or casting off a malfunctioning first or second stage and continuing to ascend on the S-4B. Unlike Booster during the first moments of launch, Fido did not have the authority to call an abort unilaterally. His switch was to be reserved for situations in which flight and the flight crew had already decided to abort, but were waiting to reach a particular range and velocity before they did so. In such a case, Fido would use his switch to tell them when that moment had arrived. But these were only a limited subset of the many situations in which an abort might become necessary. During powered flight, the rule of thumb was that the flight controllers had from about 15 to 20 seconds to make an abort decision. For anything more exigent than that, the crew would take action based on their onboard displays. But for a problem that involved control of the vehicle, multiple engine failures, a hard-over engine, meaning an engine that had gone out of control and gimbaled to its limit, or trajectory deviations, the astronauts would have, in Kranz's words, no clue in the world what the hell had gone on, and the controllers would have to take the lead. If the controllers took longer than 20 seconds, a spacecraft caught in a turning motion would probably break the tension ties that held the CSM to the rest of the vehicle, and then they would have a whole new set of problems to worry about. So what we had to do was get our timing down for that case where we had lost control just due to engine hardovers, said Kranz, and we had to get the crew off before we had structural failure. The SimSoups kept working that case. The difference between the earlier manned programs and Apollo was that all of the old problems had multiplied. In Mercury and Gemini, there had been one period of powered flight, the launch phase, and 3 abort modes: return to Earth using the escape tower to separate, at higher altitudes, separation without the escape tower, and in the latter stages of powered flight, abort to orbit. In Apollo, there were 6 separate instances of powered flight: the launch phase, translunar injection, lunar orbit insertion, lunar descent, lunar ascent, and trans-Earth injection. During all of those phases, except lunar ascent and trans-Earth injection, there were multiple abort modes to worry about. In Apollo, the flight control team had to be prepared to fly 2 completely separate spacecraft, each with its own maze of systems. Against this backdrop, the SimSoups began to prepare the flight control team and the astronauts to land on the moon. Since Mercury, all the Sims had become closed-loop, meaning that the computers driving the Sims could react to the controller's actions, changing the scenario as the Sim played out. Occasionally, they ran long-duration Sims, where the goal was to exercise the flight controllers in a routine, systematic fashion, give them problems that were not imminently mission-threatening or life-threatening, and make sure that everyone was fully on top of his system. But the computer's increased sophistication was more useful for the other kind of Sim, the ones that focused on the 4 most difficult of the mission phases: launch and entry, ascent and descent, and left controllers damp with sweat. In flight operations for Apollo, the words descent and ascent always meant specifically descent to and ascent from the lunar surface, never the Earth's surface. Several similar potential confusions of wording had to be resolved during the Apollo missions. The old familiar go and no-go convention, for example. What would the message go mean to a crew that had just landed on the moon? That all systems were go meaning okay, or that they should go meaning leave? Tyndall decreed that stay and no stay be substituted while the LEM was on the surface. Now the SimSoups could double, triple, and quadruple the load on the controllers. A failure in the ECOM system could be followed by an independent failure in the reaction and control system, and that one could be followed by static in the primary voice link. The point was to load the flight control team with several problems at the same time, to approach the controller's absolute capacity to absorb and react to a constantly deteriorating situation. They always tried to run those in double time or close to it, said one controller, throwing perhaps 24 problems at a single controller in the 15 minutes prior to landing. You had to field the problem, snap out a call, and move on to the next problem almost instantaneously, or you were going to be working on an old problem while a new one had caused the LEM to crash. The logic behind this brutal routine was that just such a combination of failures would create a disaster in a real flight. The simulation controllers liked to think of themselves as being imaginative and creative. To the controllers, devious and sneaky seemed more apt. But the men who devised the Sims had to be that way. They could assume that any controller who was promoted into the mocher was cool and quick, or else he wouldn't have gotten to the front room. There was no point in simulating the obvious malfunctions because he would swat those down instinctively. A good sim was one in which the nature of the problem was masked, in which there was an obvious answer, wrong, a more subtle answer, still wrong, and a right answer that only the most suspicious and persistent mind would see as a possibility. The one constraint on the sim soups was that, by unwritten understanding, they could not give the flight control team a problem for which there was no answer. No matter how bad things got, the controllers could always say to themselves that somehow, somewhere, it was in their power to save the lives of the crew. Within that single constraint, the sim soups could subject the controllers to any combination of horrors. We would dig into the system and find little things, recalled Dick Coos, who ran Sims from the first Mercury days on into Apollo and was nominated by one veteran controller as the most devious sim soup. Coos would flip through schematics of the systems, looking for some obscure little diode, and then work out what would happen if that diode should fail. The more utterly unconnected the diode and the resulting failure, the better. The more work it made for the controllers, the better. Okay, that'll keep him real busy for a while, Coos would say when he found a good one, and watch with anticipation from behind the window in the sim control area to see how the controllers reacted. Just because a failure seemed impossible didn't mean that the sim soups couldn't go ahead and make it happen anyway. Thus one ebullient and notoriously inventive sim soup, Bob Holken, was poring through the procedures books looking for arcane rules and found one for console failure in the Moker. The procedure said that if a console failed, the controller at that console was to move over to the next console and so on down the line, the theory being that the last controller, Retro, would move on to Booster's console, which was empty after the launch phase. Holken found that the way to create the maximum motion, which was his objective, would be to cause a failure in Guido's console at the far right-hand side of the trench. But Holken couldn't figure out how to make it fail. Not surprisingly, the designers of the consoles had gone to great lengths to prevent such an event from occurring. Holken found that the only way to shut down the console was to throw its circuit breaker. So Holken got hold of one of the Moker's maintenance men and arranged with him to come in early one morning. Together they pulled up some of the floor panels, ran a nylon cord from the SCA up into the back of the Guido console, and wrapped the end of the cord around the circuit breaker. They replaced the floor panels, hiding the cord, and Holken retired to the SCA to wait. Steve Bales was Guido that morning, and they were running a simulation of the ascent from the moon. At the right moment, which is to say at the most delicate part of the ascent phase, Holken pulled the string, and god dang if it didn't work. I heard this big pop, Bales recalled, like somebody shot a gun in front of me, and the whole console went blank. He had to do something. He was sitting in a critical chair for that part of the mission. But I couldn't, I froze. He looked at Jay Green, the Fido who was sitting next to him. Green shrugged. He was busy with his own problems. I've lost my console, Bales told Flight forlornly, and then just sat there for about 30 seconds, frantically casting about in his mind for something to do. He had never encountered the obscure musical chairs rule that Holken had found, but the sim soup always left you a way out, he told himself. He finally thought to ask the O&P controller to put the Guido screen up on one of the 10x10 displays at the front of the Moker. Not the prescribed solution, but a fine demonstration of controller ingenuity. Holken smiled at the memory. We went to great lengths to put malfunctions in. Usually these were integrated sims in which the astronauts would work from their full-scale simulators in Building 5 or at the Cape, and the flight control team would interact with the crew just as they would during a real flight. By the time of the Apollo flights, the simulators for the flight hardware, both the command module and the LEM, had become highly realistic. The astronauts not only had working versions of all the spacecraft's switches and levers, they had a view out the window of the LEM simulator showing the lunar surface as it would appear during the descent phase. In another section of Building 5, MSC technicians had built a plaster of Paris model of the lunar landing site. As the LEM simulator descended, a camera mounted above the model of the landscape would mimic its movements. Occasionally, this became gulpingly realistic. There was, for example, the time when the sim scenario called for a radar altimeter failure. The astronauts descending in the LEM were led to believe that they were at a ridiculously high altitude for that point in the descent. Failing to recognize the hardware breakdown, the crew accelerated their descent so much that they were unable to recover when, in the last few seconds, watching the lunar landscape come rushing up at them, they realized their mistake. The camera came down so hard that it smashed the lens against the plaster of Paris. To the astronauts, the impending crash looked all too real. Sometimes the sims proceeded without the astronauts in the trainer, and one of the people in the SCA had to serve as an astro sim. The astro sim was, by the rules of the game, supposed to be able to do anything a real astronaut could do. His job was not a sought-after one. An astronaut's got literally hundreds of switches, Bob Holken observed, and he's got valves he throws, and he's got 60 pounds of flight data file that he responds to. This guy, the astro sim, is sitting there. He's got a CRT, and the ground controllers are asking him, "Would you reconfigure the switch on panel A4? And could you tell me the status of the little talkback over on the left side, and while you're there, throw the valve?" That's the way they tried to do it during a flight. Wait until they had several items to package so they didn't talk to the crew too much. Well, that's nice if you're in the spacecraft and you're floating around doing it, Holken continued. But the AstroSim's got this one CRT, and he doesn't know where in the vehicle this stuff really is, and he's asking all these other guys in the sim room, "What do I tell them? What do I tell them?" In these situations, the people behind the picture window were not above lying. "Well, just tell them the switch is already in the right position," they'd advise the AstroSim. What could the poor flight controller know? There's always the possibility that it was a transducer problem or telemetry problem, Fido pointed out. The system had enough nodes in it that there was always a possibility that the crew could be telling you one thing, and your data could be saying something else, and there was a logical explanation. Therein lay the continuing inevitable advantage of the simulation people over the controllers. Under the tough flight directors, Krantz was especially strict on this point, the controllers had to assume that the problem was real. Once in a while, however, an AstroSim would carry things too far. There was, for example, the AstroSim who, during a Gemini sim, was asked by Guido to look out his window and report the position of a particular star. The AstroSim, with no idea where that star was supposed to be, claimed that he was unable to comply with Guido's request because of cloud cover. That one didn't wash. But short of that, the AstroSims could get away with a lot. Play it as it happens, Krantz preached. Never accept the fact that it's a sim screw-up. And so the flight controller would call down to the back rooms and get readouts on obscure possibilities. Finally, when the controllers had thrashed around long enough and had proved to their satisfaction and flights that the situation in the spacecraft couldn't possibly look the way the AstroSim had told them it did, AstroSim would say, "Oh yeah, I just found out I hit this other switch with my elbow when I was over here getting out my lunch." The sims had to be survivable, but they didn't have to be fair. Each simulation was followed by a debriefing, the wake. The simulation team remained behind their picture window while Flight went to each of the controllers and asked him to describe what had led him to make the calls he had made, and whether, in retrospect, his calls were the best ones. It was a group confessional, with one controller telling his story, another chiming in to explain how his remarks had influenced the situation, the people in the back rooms describing through the intercom what had been coming up on their screens, cleansing their souls, they called it. The debriefings could be as harrowing as the flight, especially when they still had the remote sites. If you were sitting down in Australia and you screwed up, Ed Fendel recalled, Mr. Kraft, Mr. Kranz, or Mr. Hodge would get on the line and commence to tell you how stupid you were, and you knew that every switching center, every office at Goddard, ships at sea, everybody and his mother, everybody in the world was listening. And you sat there and took it. There was no mercy in those days. Day after day they went on, one after another, 8 or 10 launches in a day, 8 or 10 lunar descents, each with hideous multiple failures, each with its debriefing and one's shortcomings laid out for inspection. Bill Tyndall was not a flight controller, but he couldn't stay away. "I used to plug in and watch them go," he recalled. "It was like going to an exciting movie, watching those people work. Talk about exhausting. Handling emergencies in the missions was an absolute piece of cake by comparison. The real missions were easy."
And that was Chapter 21, Part 2 of Apollo by Charles Murray and Catherine Bly Cox. Back in a minute. Charlie Kirk, rest in peace.